principles of human rights in tax policy that we are launching. And among these principles, we have the emphasis of states having to adopt all financial and required fiscal policies within a tax framework that's sustainable. This is principle 8. Now, this principle is a complementary support document that's called Tax Policy and Human Rights, redefining tax responsibility, that was written by Pedro Rossi and myself, Grazielle David, and Sergio Chaparro. And you can find all of these on these documents and the rest of the documents on our website. I'm speaking in Portuguese, however, we have Spanish and English interpretation. You can select the language of preference. Well, we will start with our event. Today, our speakers talking about responsibility are the professor of the Institute of Economy in Rio de Janeiro University, Ricardo Martner, Pedro Rossi, and he is professor at Unicamp and member of the Committee of Specialists for Human Rights in Tax Policy, and Horacio Corti, he's professor of Buenos Aires University, and he's also member of this committee and of an independent commission on international tax policies. Now, this event is organized by UNICAP, INESC, Brazil, and the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And to start, I would like to pass the floor to our organizers. So we will start with Livy, please. Good day, everyone. My name is Livy. I work at SP, which is a socioeconomic center. That's one of the organizers fostering initiatives and principles of human rights in tax policy. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of this debate, to bring this debate on tax responsibility and these concepts, that appear to be so technical, but they are political, beyond social movements and groups and unions. And this is a little bit of the role of INESC and the different organizations of civil society that are fostering and promoting this initiative and this event. Thank you very much. Hopefully this is a great event. Thank you, Sergio.
Muchas gracias a Grazielle, muchas gracias a todos, todas y todos quienes están aquí presentes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I would also like to thank all of the organizations that co-organize this event, INESC, FES Brazil, Unicamp. It is truly a pleasure and honor to be with you today in this half of the week for tax justice and human rights. And I think that I really like to congratulate you for the discussion that we will have today, because this is very important for the region.
Derecho y economía en
the discussion between right and economy in contexts such as Chile today, that is adhered to a new constitution, or in contexts such as the Colombian one, where there is a huge social conflict as a product of the disconnection between tax decisions and citizens' concerns that has brought to a massive demonstration and a huge social explosion. Just as in Brazil, where expenses roof or top has brought to an austerity for which social and economic rights have been sacrificed. So this makes the debate utterly important and urgent. I would like to also thank the members of the experts committee that we have in this panel today, because without your permanent advice and your permanent suggestions, the document that we have launched this week wouldn't have been possible. And I think this is going to be a very valuable discussion, so we can have also your points of view, so we can acknowledge the work that you've been doing. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sergio. Now we are going to go to Gonzalo Berron. Thank you so much. We had the opportunity to work together on the content and on the new proposal because it is relatively new. In Brazil, we were able to discuss together human rights and economy. This, of course, makes the difference between the Brazilian debate. Recently, we will have the publication of a book that's focused on these different points of views. So that's exactly what Pedro Rossi is showing is the book. And at the same time, the teamwork that we did so around time. I always remember in 2015, Pedro, when we were sitting there in 2016, 2015, dining together, talking about this expense limit. And we specifically talked about how these fiscal situations and economic situations in general impacted the lives of people and completely impacted human rights too. So we have walked this path together. And for us, this was always an honor, to be part of this debate. Well, I really want to thank you for all of this teamwork. And I wish that this is a great debate. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. And now we will talk a little bit about the matter at hand, which is redefining tax responsibilities. Remember that you have simultaneous interpreting services. Half of our participants will be speaking in Portuguese and the other half in Spanish. So don't forget that you can select the language of your preference. So now we will go with Pedro Rossi. Thank you so much, Grazielle. So I would like to thank the institutions and our dear Gonzalo, Livy, Sergio, and of course the initiative of principles and guidelines that, as I mentioned during the launch of the book at the beginning of the week, is a very courageous document and initiative that offers a new tax policy, a new paradigm in a very timely way and manner so that we can launch this document and we can open up for debate. I would also like to congratulate my colleague Horacio and Ricardo. They are friends that I have learned from a lot during the debate processes in this initiative. And I really want to thank Grazielle and David for organizing this event. And without them, it would have been possible. I'm going to have a PowerPoint presentation. It's going to be very quick. I just want to show you the main ideas of our article, which is a document that offers a lot of information related to this. I'm going to talk about these matters, and the idea is for you to read this article, for you to please download it from our webpage. And we are going to have it available for you. So the name is Tax Policy and Human Rights, Redefining Tax Responsibilities, along with Grazielle David and Sergio Chaparro joining us here today. So this article has brought us three topics, and I have three slides to discuss it with you. So I'm just going to talk about a part of the story. So first, it would be an approach between economy and human rights. And actually, there is a conflict of language that we can see in many aspects. First, a regulatory human rights approach and a positive economic approach, and not any type of economy, but a mainstream one that's almost in a public debate and in the academia. In the field of economy, the economy has a positive approach that does not involve judgments and that it's set in order to try to quantify economic agents and aiming for the efficiency, which is very important. In the case of human rights, the social goal is to guarantee rights and also guarantee these rights. So the orthodox situation here brings us to social well-being through this quantification of utilities. So the economy has a language that talks about utilitarianism, which ends up being then utilitarianism. So this starts from the individual to understand their realities because they are independent from the social environment. So this explains, of course, the social media. So rights are not intrinsic to an approach. Social and economic rights mainly are byproducts of an organized economy, organized by the market, for example. I could think about economic reforms that generate more efficiency, but this is not a problem for the neoclassical school. For example, the work efforts that could help reach a better level of employment. For example, there is a balance in the real estate market where I have 10 million people, but and these 10 million people are homeless. So they need to increase the balance and they need to use social availability in this economic language. And this not necessarily respect their rights because the goal is a goal of maximizing the social utility that's subordinated to human rights. So many times, human rights end up being subordinated to the idea of reaching social well-being. So, and the object of analysis is different, and the idea of social well-being is completely different from the point of view of human rights. And this reality is built by political action. So from the orthodox economy point of view, it is the result of the efficient use of resources. And of course, orthodox economy issues a language that covers right defense. And when there is a defense of the rights, well, it is a justified defense, not as a moral value and not as a right either, but as a positive externality. For example, when there is a criticism to racism in the Orthodox language, this criticism is also done because of an inefficient situation. Racism is a problem of individuals and not as a social means a problem. And it is a problem of efficiency and utility. So it is individualizing everything, even unemployment, because it is a problem of economy and not a right that should be guaranteed by the state. This is a starting point. This is a very important starting point. The second session of our article is articulated as follows. It covers equality, tax policy, and human rights. So these three concepts need to be considered using tax policy, which is the distributive policy that guarantees human rights. And I want to stress on the fact that there is a search for employment and income, which are conditions of several social and economic rights. And this is something that has to be rescued, but not only from an economic perspective, but we need to consider tax policy beyond what these human rights brings, because we need to put it to the center, to the core of the document, which we did. And I also want to stress that when we talk about inequality, it's not the same as talking about human rights. Economists study inequality. There's a lot of work on the impact on inequality, and very little work on the impact of tax policy on human rights. And I am comparing income, I am comparing access to human rights, because if there is access or not to drinking water, for example, knowing if there have this or that income, if they are in poverty levels. So all of these are different approaches. I can reduce inequality and keep on neglecting human rights. Indicators not always explain the relationship between human rights. So it is necessary to include human rights not only in inequality dimension, which has also been discussed by economists particularly, while the human rights dimension has been neglected. So this is one of the aspects that we addressed in section 2 of the article. And well, in the last section of our article, we talk about the dimension of tax policy, of tax rules, and it proposes a redefinition of the concept of tax policy, which is tax responsibility. So the section starts with a debate on fiscal policy and readdresses the tax policy from post-war times. And of course, there's evidently a change there that goes from tax policy that should take care of the economy. So it protects income and employment, and it differentiates it from the presumption, which is, of course, that during the post-war, the predominating vision was the tax policy that should surveil the balance of the economy. So during the 80s, what we see is a predominant view that aims for tax policy to balance the budget, and the macroeconomic policy should look after price stability and not unemployment. So this was during the 80s. And recently we see that now that has been changing directions, and international organizations have been created with economists' discourse that turns tax policy in a factor for economy recovery. And I think that with this, it would be the right time to go over this situation, of growth and income and employment, but also the dimension of human rights and the reduction of inequality in this debate. So, when we redefine the idea of tax responsibility, we consider 3 pillars. First is the tax policy that should have at the core the promotion of human rights and generating employment in its quantitative dimension, which guarantees the right to work. And it is good to remember that unemployment is a waste of resources, besides violating the right to employment. So economists forget this. So tax policy aims for budget balance, even with the waste of resources such as workforce labor. That's what we allocate, and this is so important because it violates the right of to work. So we are proposing that tax policy should respect rights just as they appear in the document. In this document, it explains the process. We also propose to orient tax policies with social and environmental missions. So social goals, social expenses, it's a debate on tax payment. And last but not least, tax policy should promote social stability, which considers employment and income, and the warranty of minimum content of human rights and a progressive performance. So it is not only about stability to tax sustainability, it's also reaching it in different ways, as well as the distribution of social resources, which has to be carried out in a way that it guarantees employment and human rights. And this should be in the third pillar of tax policy, where the promotion of human rights is also found. And to conclude, my brief summary of the article, so I can invite you to read it, we will have a discussion. We had a discussion on what's this tax and social responsibility, so that these situations are considered together. And for this, it has to incorporate social responsibility. So tax policy guarantees rights and well-being. So then a tax policy turning their back to employment, a tax policy that allows violating human rights cannot be considered a responsible tax policy. So this is irresponsible. So the concept of tax responsibility needs to be disputed, and the warranty of human rights have to be in this concept. It doesn't matter if we have tax authority that will punish tax policies and tax representatives when the balance is being broken, but it doesn't matter if they are not going to punish them when they violate human rights. This is just useless. So we are modifying the comprehension of the role of policy and the concept of tax responsibility. So with this, I would like to conclude, and I would like to congratulate all of us for this initiative. Thank you so much, Pedro, for reminding us that there's no tax responsibility without social responsibility, without guaranteeing people's rights to nature. And now to continue, I would like to pass the floor to Esther Dweck. Thank you, Grazielle. I would like to congratulate you for this initiative and for the initiative that we are part, because it is a very, very broad work that brings the results of the broad discussion that we've had, and a little bit aligned to what Pedro said, in order to have a change of direction of the tax policy that's responsible to the concern of guaranteeing human rights and guarantee the lives of others. A dignified life with a series of basic aspects that should be considered. And I would like to go back to what Pedro was saying at the end. I would like to reinforce some topics and show how this has changed a little, and also talk about Brazil's case. I didn't participate in the document, but I participated in some discussions and provided some follow-up on the preparation. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Brazil's situation, because I think that it is quite emblematic. In Brazil, what's being discussed today hasn't been reinforced. We cannot think about tax responsibilities associated to human rights. On the contrary, we need to rethink the concept of tax responsibility. Actually, I think that the Declaration of Human Rights itself, considered in a chronological way, has a very broad vision that comes from post-war times. It's because of it, actually, that they are together in post-war. And after all of the horrors that we saw, so not concerning for human dignity is just awful. We saw the horrors of the Second World War, and the world appeared at that time to rethink, talking about the Western world, a new to construct a new world in which nations could behave differently, properly. So we start having a vision of tax policies that go beyond the restricted vision that the world had before, that was focused on only economic aspects. So, changes from post-war times combines these elements significantly, bringing, as Pedro said, a main concern, which is guaranteeing employment, the right to employment, but also talking about tax policies. It was not aligned to human rights, as Pedro was saying, because actually what happened during post-war times was a great time for the state, meeting very broad efforts to guarantee education, health, although we know that it was not guaranteed throughout the world. However, it is this perception of well-being is started to be expanded, and it approaches to the concept of human rights with the vision of economists of reduced with the view of wealth kind of reduced in terms of economists health, sorry. And we have almost 40% of developed countries where the state is playing a very important role with key sectors to guarantee human dignity besides education, health, a series of other areas that are very important and that need to be guaranteed. So this process agrees with the golden time of the world capital. So it is not by chance. It is something that we always highlight. It is not by chance. And this is where it was proven that associating these situations is positive for the combined social rights. And I think this is a great choice. And this, of course, had to do with the impact on social structure, because the world generated a reaction that caused for the concept to change between the 60s and the 70s. As Pedro said, there was a restricted political view focused on what would be mainly sustainability, even when we don't have a unique concept of sustainability of public life. So in this sense, what happens is that the countries start finding, because they don't have tax policies that relate to a tax responsibility. So today we are considering that this should be linked and should be associated to world economy funding to provide a certain guarantee of those creditors of the debt. But it shouldn't be like that. It should be considering the debtors, the community. So human rights cannot be respected if we do not associate these aspects, because people think that this will have a positive effect in community, but it's the contrary. We know that emerging countries or poor countries or small countries were not able to reach this level of development. And these measures have been imposed internally or some other way, even through international bodies or mechanisms. And this is where we have a restrictive process. So we see a process of slowing down of the economy where the inequality and poverty have increased, and indicators of human rights have also worsened. So in this period, there is a growing trend and an interruption in some countries during the 2000s that combines at the end with the crisis of 2008 and then with the health crisis. And all of this was linked. In Brazil, for example, there was a law approved in 2000, well, that started in 2000, that brought several concepts of strictly policy strictly adhered to the debt, but on the contrary, the rest of the world tried to flexibilize the rules. After the crisis in Brazil, there was an increase, but recently
E a gente, em 2016, quando o Brasil aprova,
there was a limit placed on expenses. So as a result of this, we drafted a series of documents, and one of the most important aspects is showing that if we already have a tax responsibility context, then what happened is that there was still a space for policies, but since it was a social law, then it was kind of eliminated, and this would give Brazil a construction of well-being that would allow to have a better integration and a better dignity to guarantee human rights. So this is one of the principles of our constitution. So fortunately, we have the constitution with that adheres to the Brazilian law. So what we did was finishing with any sort of Brazilian rights. So we went back to the idea that tax policy should be environmented in a restricted social effort. So in a economic crisis moment, after all of the posterior happenings, we had a huge debate on the reform based on the concepts that Pedro presented. We cannot talk about tax responsibility because it is completely irresponsible. Even with the pandemic, we already have poverty increasing, inequality increasing. So a very important part of the population didn't have the minimum conditions for it. And in education and public health, without talking about the scientific aspect even, they were not guaranteeing human rights. For example, employment was one of the less guaranteed. So we need a central initiative to bring this debate to Brazil and to the rest of the world that had already opened for a debate, but during the pandemic, it was reinforced. So I think that one of the effects that has already been presented by other economists are one of the main intermediaries that are already talking about the need of a policy that's more inclusive. Even they are mentioning this. So this is why we have to rethink the concept of tax responsibility that has as a central aspect the guarantee of human rights so that they are truly responsible. In this sense, I wanted to stress on the importance of different initiatives and reinforce the importance of debates. And especially in Brazil, this is one of the countries where it is very important. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for helping us remember the taxes in Brazil. So the agreements have not been respected. That's what what I mainly understand from you. So now we are going to go to Horacio Corti.
Muchas gracias a todos los organizadores de este evento tan importante. Realmente les agradezco.
Thank you so much for your invitation. I truly thank you for thinking about me. And I would like to thank all of the colleagues that we have been working with and that we worked with during the draft of these principles. I miss you so much. So Hopefully, this pandemic tragedy can help us move forward so we can meet again differently in different situations. I think that these principles are very important in many levels. On one hand, they accept a legal construction that the universal human rights system has been doing for many years. We have dedicated to sum up and synthesize the best of this doctrine in order to be able to advocate an influence in the Inter-American system, the Inter-American system of human rights that has already started walking that road of reception. As we know, the Inter-American Commission has already had two audiences on tax policy and human rights, and these situations have been already mentioned on poverty and human rights in 2017. So I think that there is a very important advocacy field where these principles are significant. But it does not stop here, because there's a lot of advocacy in national levels and practical and theoretical levels. And I'm going to very briefly cover, from my specialty, the financial and tax right and the constitutional financial and tax right. Pedro recently talked about the change of paradigm in public finances, thinking about human rights. So it would mean changing dominant paradigms on how, until today, the public sector economy was considered. So we would need to rethink that double stream that the public economy had, that we could symbolize in Marshall and Buchanan. So it was very important. However, there's something there that we have to rethink differently. The same happens in the field of financial law and constitutional or financial law. And I think that this paradigm change, just as it happens in economy, is functioning in the environment of law. So we come from national and constitutional law, but already thinking about these changes, and this is also more concrete within the new drafts of the most recent constitutions, where this paradigm change can be seen very clearly. There is a symbolic value. So I always like talking about the recent Mexican Constitution that has an article that says, and I very briefly share, the exercise of the IRS, I mean state public finances, will orient to effectively meeting and adhering to rights. And I think this is something unprecedented and very important, and it comes from our legal Latin American tradition, where in general we always see ourselves as simple receivers, but over there's something that has been done with constitutional law is quite innovative, and that clarifies the idea that Pedro just mentioned that's underlying in these principles. There is an intimate connection. It is not exterior. There's a liaison and interiority between human rights system and public finances. So we cannot think about finances without rights, and we cannot think about rights without finances. And I say that this is a change because how was a constitutional financial law and the tax financial law considered in general? Because we cannot say that rights were not considered. However, it was a vision that was quite biased, because mainly, or the core, were some financial institutions. And basically the axis, when talking about rights, they talked about tax payment. And particularly, the rights that were concerning were two: the right to property and economic liberties or freedom. So always the jurists' thinking on rights at a financial level was We have a tax, we have a state institute that could damage rights and that could damage property or economic freedom. So we need to protect those taxpayers through the typical expression, letter of rights for the taxpayer. So it is very interesting to have a correlationship that has to be done with what Pedro said. The neoclassical economy considers or thinks about the rights, but the only rights that are relevant for them are how to assign in a clear way or how to allocate the property right, and we ensure economic freedom of the market agents. The rest of the political values that our legal system turned into rights are not considered right by this economic thinking. So it is clear in externality, and they have to be included other way because they don't have centrality nor for property nor for economic freedom. And the same thing happened at a legal level. Tax payment and the state was not considered as a necessary mean or as a condition for the effectiveness of people's rights. But when we think about the midst of a pandemic and the right to health, what do we need? State activity, buying vaccines, safety, a lot of public policies. And how are we going to fund this? How are we going to fund these public policies? Well, we think about tax payments as a funding. This is why many considered adequate those discussions in our society on how to create some tax complement that's progressive right now in order to be able to surpass the crisis. So it is a very different thinking that's putting at stake the economic and the legal aspects. And of course, this typical thinking, this classic thinking would limit budget and public spending because it considers procedures or competencies that each body can address, or currently, as it is going on in Brazil, Colombia, and Europe, tax rules, roofs or tops, limits not to spend. But in their minds, in the minds of those who do and think the public budget, do not consider the concept relationship between expense and rights. So this is something that we have in our region rethought, rethought constitutional law, financial law. And I think that this is the same thing that the economists also do. And I think what we've been bringing from international law, from human laws, is quite strong to be able to rethink all of this and then act. Because in practice is very important, yes, but practice needs thinking to be able to have a rational practice that's adequate and justified, and then with power and consensus enough so that it can be efficient in reality. So I think that, and with this I conclude, discussion opportunity is open as of principles, because it is a discussion within our inter-American system to see if we can generate awareness on the importance of tax policy. A discussion, as Pedro said, on what public finances do and think, which is basically economists, public accountants, specialists in public accounting, and then a discussion with the legal community to rethink financial law, but also a discussion with operators, for example, with legislative operators and judicial operators that are those who appear when economic systems do not give answers. So people go to the judges to get some answers. So this needs a systematization of everything that international law of human rights says on tax policy. Because, and with this conclude, Mexico, Argentina incorporated international law to our constitution. But in order to seriously apply that international law, we need to systematize and to know everything that's said on tax policy. And I say this because there have been some cutbacks in our regions, Mexico and Argentina, where this international law over tax policy is incorporated, but in a fragmented way, not in all of its systematization. And I think that this is something that we also provide through our principles. And I don't think I have more time, so thank you so much for the invitation, and for the attention. It is very interesting what you just said. It is specifically one phrase that you just said. The important that we need to constantly remember that expenses exist to guarantee rights. These are not expenses. And these are responsible, of course, of economic and fiscal conversations. So we think about expense as a problem, but the expense is to guarantee rights. And these human rights are in the document, are very useful. For example, transparency, accountability, to guarantee that actually financial law is used to aid this. Thank you so much, everyone, for the invitation. This week has been very interesting, and considering tax justice right now is something that I would say that is of immediate effect. I see Sergio with his solidarity with Colombia. So I also want to show you my solidarity. I am in Chile. I'm so sorry. I think I'm going to have to buy a new computer. I'm sorry for the image, but... And I wanted to tell you, first of all, that there was just recently a lesson learned from the constituents. And this, of course, shows two things that my colleagues have already mentioned that won't be quite possible in this framework. First, discussion between lawyers and economists, because there was one economist elected and he was neoliberal on top of it. So I don't know, we were laughing because he's going to have to eat in a small corner that he will be given for him to be calm, because it has been an avalanche of human rights, of an understanding of tax responsibility that's quite different to the one that we had during the last 30 years. And with very specific reivindications, territory, water rights, environment, feminism, and all of this in a white sheet of paper, just as I have it here. So everything is going to be discussed. And in this sense, what Horacio is proposing, and I find very interesting, that this type of thing could be in a clean constitution. And they have a year to debate it. And this, of course, has a lot of independent components. And by linking the document or the documents with this experience, I would like to address three topics. One would be planning, global planning. There was a young woman elected as mayor, so we have to, and she said, we have to go from regular planning to multi-planning. She said that yesterday. This means an urgency, a need of transparency and of planning of what human rights application truly means, something that has already been discussed during the 60s. You in Brazil, Pedro, Esther, very well know the difficulties that this entail. However, these are experiences that we need to do from the perspective of the medium-term tax policy, which is some of the components that we could add to the analysis that Pedro did. The capacity or the capacity from the governments to generate a tax policy that's responsible and transparent and with the right indicators. The second, which is quite related to this, is the quality of public spending. A lot has been said on public spending. And as I have seen in Brazil debates, the quality of public spending is just eliminating subsidies or current spending. And this is a concept that goes way beyond, and that's quite related to the ability of the state to have access to public assets. And I think that Pedro very well explained it. We are talking about access to public services. So it is not a matter of efficiency or efficacy or doing things better. It is just one matter. which is quite important. But it is about planning for development, which means access, And I think that we are all quite far from this, especially with this pandemic where we have impoverished one more time. And it's hard to have access to services and rights that we all deserve. So there's a second point there. And let me see if the Constitution can add it, which is related to indicators. And the third is progressiveness of tax services, tax collection. How can we do for our tax representatives to concern about this? How can we reach a better tax justice from the tax collection entities? I think that this needs to be considered from the point of view of constitutionalists. And well, as we have proposed many times, it is about generating not judgments or a republic of judges persecuting the ministries of economy or the IRS or those, but to create a network of analysts and researchers that are able to effectively put on the table with a technical basis these type of situations. It cannot be, and why talking about Colombian tax reform? But I mean that things shouldn't be done just like that, reforms without even having a redistributive capacity, or where we are working a tax just because, we need to discuss taxing the super rich. So there is an amount of topics that are just out there on the air, and it's very important to start addressing for tax justice. And I already lived for a year in Brazil during the 80s. So I did a lot of friends. More or less I understand, but I don't dare speak in Portuguese. So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Ricardo. It is very interesting what you are saying. Planning for development has to do with the access to services, to the rights that we all deserve. So it is essential, what you're saying. And it really orients us to how to plan, to properly plan fiscal policies in the perspective of human rights. Well, now we are right on time. We already have an hour. We already had some questions that have already been answered. So I think that now I'm going to pass the floor to you so that you can have a final comment. Pedro, please. Yes, I just want to thank and stress the importance of meeting today, listening to our colleagues and Ricardo, Horacio, and well, it was great being able to complement our presentations. I think that we have the renewal request. It is great to hear Ricardo talk about Chile and the hope that we have, So this debate is the way that we are seeing the changes that are going to in the international scenario. And Horacio put it very well in terms of rights. So economy needs our effort, Economists are a little bit falling behind in this discussion. And I think that, Ricardo, well, we need to bring back the debate so this can be emphasized on, because tax debate is a very difficult debate to have. And even with the support of the institutions, and when they support our different causes, this debate is still quite different, and we need to transform. But I think that we are going to make it. And we have already changes. And these changes will reach Brazil and Latin America soon. I know that there are still some questions, but I wanted to remind you that tomorrow in Twitter, on the initiative of Human Rights and Tax Policy, which is DH-Pol Fiscal, you can participate in a discussion that we will have in a place that's called Twitter Spaces tomorrow at 1 p.m. Colombia and Mexico, 2 p.m. Chile, and 3 p.m. Brazil and Argentina. So Twitter Spaces, this is an initiative of human rights in tax policy. So, yes, Sergio, you have a question? Yes, I just want to thank you for this opportunity to have a luxury panel. And as of the context that already explained very well, and as well as the context that Pedro and Esther have presented, I think that in Brazil there are fundamental progress that we will have to expand, at least from civil context. I need that in Brazil, the civil context is quite adverse. There is a diversity that hasn't seen that much. And as I said at the beginning, you have sacrificed rights in the altar of tax discipline. But I think that from civil society, there has been a very valuable response from the academia and from social movements. And from the academia, I'm talking about the post-pandemic book led by Pedro and Esther, and that Pedro is showing. And I think that it shows a way that we have to go through in our countries to be able to propose a different vision where finances are understood as an instrument at the service of rights, and that this investment extracts concrete implications in how to do macro fiscal changes and how budget processes need to be built, among other measures. And the same thing comes with a coalition of very strong organizations, for example, En Direitos Valem Mais. And I think that in terms of right, of law, it is important to see how a critical mass is created from lawyers, tax lawyers, from the practice of constitutional right and law, to think how law can be at the service of creating public finances that allow
y en ese sentido, creo
guaranteeing rights. And in this sense, for example, the constitutional experience in Colombia,
ha sido muy valiosa.
Jurisprudence experience has been quite valuable when developing judicial techniques that could be very useful for posterior work of the courthouses in Chile on how to address tax policy from a systemic perspective. Of course, Ricardo was just saying it is not about judicialized tax policy and an attempt for all of the remedies to come from judges. But I think it is very important to have protection warranties coming from the judicial branch, as we've had them in Colombia. And among other, they have been not enough. They haven't been enough, which is fundamental for the financial constitution to be an instrument at the service of rights warranty. So we need to think constitutions in fiscal aspects that truly allow in planning, connecting tax planning with the enjoyment of rights that allow also, for example, who participate in the decision-making processes, through which mechanisms will they achieve that service of finances to human rights. So I just wanted to ask to all of the panel members, what reforms and what concrete measures do you think that would be a priority to discuss in these contexts? Where to start so that we can ensure the implementation of this focus of tax policy that's at the service of rights? Thank you. Well, I think we would have to expand the event one more hour, but I hope that your final comments can allow you to maybe address this a little bit. So now I pass the floor to Esther. Thank you. I think that this is very important, but in Latin American context, each country will have their own answer. Even in Brazil, we are in a process of keeping our constitution, while Chile is in a process of redrafting the constitution. And we had one constitution after the democratization processes, just as in Argentina. There were other times when a progressist administration. So each country has a different time to guarantee. So I think that we are in a country and in a time of resistance, trying to reduce this to afterwards strengthen. And an important point that we have to reinforce is that it doesn't matter if we only have constitutions. I mean, guaranteeing rights is much more than just clauses. We realize that our supreme authority hasn't found a way to guarantee rights. So having just a judicial system to guarantee rights is not enough. Yes, it is important to attempt to link the right to economy to guarantee human rights, which is very important, yes. But we cannot depend on this only. We need other mechanisms, and among these, I think that evidently civil society's capacities of reivindicating this in this sense is just what's going on in Colombia. So strengthening civil society, even in a hard time like they're going to, is a fundamental element. And we also had a process of reduction of social participation and a difficulty, as Sergio already mentioned, because these are localized efforts. For example, next year with the elections, I think that this is going to be put in discussion once again. So as Pedro said, unfortunately, Brazilian economists, Pedro and myself, do not really represent economists in Brazil. So we are not only a group of two, but we are also a minority, unfortunately. The sector is also delayed in this perspective, but it is an important matter, an aspect that needs to be put on the table to rebuild society in a dignified way, with harmony and aligned with human rights. So this is a combination of conditions with economic standards, so that everyone goes to the same direction and not all against all. So once again, I'd like to thank everyone for organizing this event and for inviting me. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It was a great experience being here. And I think this is a great experience to continue and expand this critique for debate. Thank you. Thank you, Esther. Now I would like to pass the floor to Horacio Corti. Yes, each country has different positions, but since Ricardo already mentioned it, the constitutional time in Chile, it's the right time to think about this. And I believe that the first practical thing would be that there has to be awareness. If you think about human rights, you need to think about finances. So this is a central, a core aspect of a constitutional reform, that you cannot leave others for the thinking and then go back to tradition. But the way we are developing it is the core way of the Constitution. And the second practical idea, I think that a formula such as the one of Mexico's Constitution or something similar that shows a relationship between public finances and constitutional rights. And this is key for the control and the policy that will come later on. Then we will have to develop everything, but I think that this is a very important time to generate what I call a financial constitution already conceived from human rights. And this is something that I don't know if any previous constituent process has happened like that. Thank you, Horacio. It is so interesting to hear it like that. And now I would like to ask also to go to Ricardo, talking about Chile. Well, there has been times of absolute cleansing, you know, of all of the history. So a white sheet of paper. So one would like to build from this. It is hard to set criteria. I remember in Brazil, in the times where the Constitution was created, and how Antonio Amado proposed and insisted on the fact that there had to be a constitutional change. And also, that's how this was created, a ministry that on those days had a strength and a will of human rights protection. So doing something like this, well, I don't know, Sergio, we don't know if we are going to have this constitutional certainty. We don't know anything. We would have to start convincing people, although clearly no one is prophet on their own land. So I see that your experience as our brother Latin American brothers and sisters is going to be quite useful for the constituents, because you have already gone through these processes and you know more or less the limits of it. Because right now we are limitless. We are young, independent, that want to redo the country. There's a year for that, so we will have to discuss it from different point of views. But for me, I think that externalizing is very important. I mean, we have transparency in the sense of generating networks and technical capacity to accompany the process of tax policy and protecting human rights. And when to judicialize, I don't know. I think that there is a political sanction that's not little. I mean, you have to consider indicators, which is quite complex. However, we need to see what are going to be the limits of the political sanction and the judicial sanction. I mean, all of the countries have had this type of doubts or problems, except here because there was no planning, so no one had to be in charge of this, in charge of their own decisions, except political punishment or sanctions. So it's news under development. Thank you, Ricardo. It's quite interesting. We will be pending further news, okay? Now I would like to ask you to join us in the graphic illustration, you know, the summary of the panel that we've had today. So we have everything there, everything that we have discussed today. Thank you so much for your work. And afterwards, well, I will ask you to go to the Twitter spaces to keep on discussing. So we will also meet again tomorrow. Thank you so much for participating, and a lot of success for the remaining of the events. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Chao, chao.
Chao, chao. ¿Sabes cuál es la relación entre la política fiscal y los derechos humanos? Los derechos humanos son los derechos que toda persona tiene por existir. La política fiscal es la forma en la que el gobierno obtiene los recursos para financiarse y cómo los gasta después. Esta política puede promover o generar retrocesos en la garantía de los derechos humanos. En América Latina, la región más desigual en el mundo, durante la pandemia por COVID-19, 73 multimillonarios aumentaron su fortuna en $42.000 millones, mientras se estima que 52 millones de personas ya han entrado en la pobreza. Esto demuestra que los países de América Latina no están cumpliendo con los acuerdos internacionales de derechos humanos que suscribieron. Si estos acuerdos internacionales fueran cumplidos, la política fiscal estaría al servicio de las personas y sus derechos en vez de restringirlos, que es lo que sucede hoy en la región. Con eso en mente, 7 organizaciones en América Latina se propusieron analizar estos acuerdos internacionales y aclarar cuáles son las implicaciones en derechos en materia de política fiscal. Así, surgen los 15 principios de derechos humanos en la política fiscal, que al ser aplicados por los gobiernos asegurarían que las políticas fiscales estén al servicio de los derechos. Algunas de las ideas en el documento aclaran que el Estado necesita recaudar impuestos de manera justa, de forma que los más ricos contribuyan más. Que las mujeres, las personas afrodescendientes, los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades que han sufrido discriminaciones deben tener prioridad en las decisiones del gasto. Y que la política fiscal debe ser transparente, participativa y sujeta a la rendición de cuentas. Si quieres saber más, visita nuestro sitio web.